they actually transformed the whole movement, the Women Against Daddy Warbucks, where they and no one knows how they did it. They did all these incredible things. Like they broke into 13 draft boards in Manhattan in one night.
Welcome to the Repurpose Your Purpose podcast. My name is Aurora Menegallo, and this is a podcast about doing work you love with purpose. So, Brandon, I am so excited to have you here on the show. Hi.
Hi, I'm thrilled to be here, Aurora. It's so nice to be a part of your movement that you're building.
Thank you. And for those of us that have followed Repurpose, for those of you that have followed Repurpose Your Purpose for a long time, Brandon was on one of my early panels in Los Angeles, really sharing about your experience, which was great. Brandon, I still remember it was a lot of fun.
That was fun.
But the reason why I really wanted to talk to you today is because of your new project. And I'm obsessed with it. I love it. I listened to the whole thing twice, and I think it's very, very significant for the time. And for the topic of this podcast is for my own podcast as well. But I want to ask you first to maybe say a little bit about who you are, what you do for anybody who doesn't know you, and then let's dive into divine intervention.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. It's excellent to have you here. I've been a fan of Repurpose Your Purpose for a very long time and following along in all of your adventures. And it's funny that you should mention the panel that I sat on because I believe that was at a period in my life where I was transitioning into being a professor. And I came to academia late in life, well into my 40s. I hate to describe that as late, but I really did sort of change careers and change purposes in a really significant way. I came to Los Angeles in 2006 to be like everyone else, to be a director, you know what I mean, in the movies. And I wandered around this town, and the funny thing about Los Angeles is you get here and it doesn't, like, I had moved to New York first, okay, and right out of grad school I went to the Yale School of Drama for directing. I should not have gone to the Yale School of Drama because I actually don't like theater very much. I like film. But I went there anyway, and I studied theater directing, and I sort of felt like a fraud because I'd look around and people would be like, God, these people love theater and I only like theater, you know? And so and I had to so then I went to New York and I was like, now I'm gonna direct plays. And everything I directed was an absolute flop, and I couldn't figure out how to fix it. And one night, a friend of mine who from grad school, he was one of the playwrights. He had written this play that like sort of caught fire and was eventually nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. And so he ended up being kind of a big deal TV writer. And he called me and he wouldn't let. I was directing another in a succession of flops, and I was laying on my bed staring at the ceiling in New York, and penniless. At this point in my life, I was writing checks for, it was like the Big Lebowski. I was writing checks for coffee that I knew would bounce. Like, it was awful. But I needed coffee. And he wouldn't let me off the phone until I agreed to move to Los Angeles. And so finally I agreed. And then it dawned on me, oh, wait, yes, movies. I like movies. What am I doing? What have I been living a lie? So I came to LA, and I and I sort of made this crucial mistake where I don't know how to network. I don't know how to play any sort of game that involves professional success at all. And I just sort of showed up and was like, well, I feel like I'm talented, and now I just have to wait for everyone else to notice, not realizing that everyone in Los Angeles is also talented. You know what I mean? And in fact, more talented than I am. And so just sitting around trying to be a shiny penny, waiting for someone to be like, "We've been waiting for you. Here's your opportunity." I was not built for that. Um, so I wandered around the town trying to figure out what the hell to do, getting day jobs. I started teaching acting at an acting studio, which was lovely. I started making a lot of friends. It's really easy to make friends in LA, and that part is something that I will always cherish about this town. And eventually I directed a short film, and eventually I directed a feature film, but that took like years and years of trying to figure out everything. And over the course of it all, I I ended up teaching at Occidental College, sort of this on-camera acting class, and that introduced me to the world of academia. This was 5 or 6 years ago, and suddenly it was 6 years ago. Suddenly, I was like, oh, wait a second. Actually, I think teaching like at the college level is something that I should have been doing this whole time. I mean, the problem, to give you a little more background, is that I didn't finish my undergrad degree before I went to grad school. So I didn't have a BA, and therefore I didn't have an MFA. And so I had to frantically take a bunch of classes to finish my BA. It took in total 26 years to get my BA, but then
Wow.
poof, I had an MFA. And so then I was able to, okay, now I can actually be a professor. Anyway, so I taught at Occidental for about 5 years. In that time is when I made that feature film I mentioned, and I made I made a documentary that's on PBS now, and I sort of fell into a succession of projects, film projects. And then 6 months ago, this opportunity came up. I'm leaving out the whole podcast thing, which is a whole sidebar of all this, which I'll get to. 6 months ago, an opportunity came up for a full-time faculty position at Pace University in New York City. And in reading the description, I was like, this is for someone who teaches acting, but also knows all about post-production because I've always produced my own stuff. I know all about post-production because I could never afford to hire anybody, so I had to learn it all myself. This is a description of me. And so I sent a application in and got the job. And for the last semester, starting in January, I've been teaching at Pace, and I've had to fly back and forth every week to New York City. And we're actually decamping and moving to New York on July 1st. So I'm speaking to you in my Los Angeles denouement, where I'm packing. These shelves behind me are soon to be empty. And it's sort of this poignant goodbye. Now, that's the sort of the quasi-professional thread. I'm giving you such a long answer of where I was, what I've been doing, but all of that has been procrastinating from working on this project, which became the podcast, which is my origin story, which is the story of the Catholic left. And that I've always known it was going to be my magnum opus. And so I always had to procrastinate by making a bunch of other things and doing a bunch of other projects because I never wanted to actually work on it because it was too psychologically gigantic. But I somehow have managed to do so. And the final episode of the 10 episodes dropped yesterday, and now it's out in the world and it's out of my system. And so that is the story of me so far.
Can I say something? Because the I met you because I randomly went to an event where you were telling stories at the
Hmm.
last bookstore. Okay, that's from, and I don't remember if it was just your event or you were with other people. But to me, like the one thing I always think about you is that you're a storyteller. Like amazing storyteller. That's what I think. So to me, the podcast just seems like a natural culmination or maybe step because there's gonna be many more, storytelling events in your life. But it's like it really seemed to me this amazing everything coming together
Oh,
in
thank
yeah,
you.
as a
Thank you
storyteller.
for saying that.
Yeah.
It's I forgot. Right. There was that whole other thing where I was giving, it was like sort of fake TED Talks. It was like this alt comedy experimental fake TED Talks that I did for a while.
They were awesome. They were awesome. So, all right. So your podcast is called Divine Intervention, and I was wondering if you can tell the listeners a little bit about it.
Yes. So, uh, my mother used to tell me these stories of people she knew in the 70s and 60s and 70s, who were a bunch of priests and nuns who became accomplished cat burglars in order to break into federal draft boards and steal draft files of young men that were about to be conscripted into the maw of war in Vietnam and take them away, take the draft files away, burn them sometimes, get arrested, mail them back to the draftees so that they could decide whether they wanted to go to war, things like that. But it was a bunch of these radical young Catholics, and you never hear that phrase, who were doing everything they could to sabotage the war, including committing federal crimes, which is wild to me, like just a wild story. You think of priests and nuns very differently, as these very sort of benevolent figures for the most part, who are very placid and have just a sort of serenity about them. Yet these were these badasses who were wearing balaclavas and covering their sneakers in hockey tape and using little pinhole flashlights to break into buildings so that they could sabotage the draft. And I knew I had to tell that story.
It's even wilder. Everybody, that's even wilder when you listen to every episode of the podcast. I feel like it gets wilder and wilder as a story. Well, let me tell you, there's so many things that I like about it. The first thing that I want to start with this, look, because when I heard it's in episode 2. When I heard this, I was like, I have to have Brandon on this podcast talk about it. And this is the part where so let me take a step back. There are many people, featured in this podcast, many characters, right? And two of the major ones are these young priests that join the Catholic Church and really grapple with what kind of priest they want to be.
Hmm.
And there is this quote when they have to decide like how they would answer this question, which is, are you in this world to participate in this vocation, or are you in this vocation to participate in the world?
Mm. Yeah.
So powerful. And I feel like, any one of us, the vocation, what we do for work, this is really an important question for ourselves, for each one of us.
It is. Yeah. I think about it all the time in the arts. I mean, are you in, I ask my students this and I wonder it myself. Are you in this world to participate in the arts, or are you in the arts to participate in the world? And there are two very distinct, very important type of artists that come out of that sort of dichotomy, and they're both necessary ultimately. At least in the arts, they're both necessary. Where,
Yeah.
because I thought about for a long time, I thought, well, obviously you should be in the arts to participate in the world, but that to me is just one type of person. That is a type of artist that is very important, very topical, very challenging. But then I forget about the ones who are there to challenge the art form itself and the medium, and to push the medium. And it could be the arts, it could be a job, it could be a one's profession, it could be all sorts of things. Some people are there and should be there to push out the boundaries of the profession they have chosen, and forge new frontiers, while others should use it as a platform to change the world as best they possibly can.
So through the podcast, we see Patrick and Floyd. I think it was Patrick and Floyd, like really
Hmm.
grapple with this, and then more and more people in the movement, right? And I'm curious, as you were talking to all of these people, and in a way reliving their story and reliving what they've been through, grappling with their faith and resistance and the Vietnam War. And I want to ask you more about that. Like, did you have any insights, or what did you see them come up with or discover for themselves, and how that did that affect you?
That is a great question. But I mean, one of the big challenges of this podcast was that the character of Patrick is someone who died a long time ago and of whom there's very little footage. But for various reasons, I decided that he had to be one of my main characters. And to answer your question, it is because of his answer to that question that I knew he had to be central to the story. Um, I didn't know much about Patrick and Floyd's, and there was a third seminary brother named James Carroll who has written several books, and you can read his incredible books about the Catholic Church, but also about he's a novelist, but also writes nonfiction. He's written a ton about the Catholic Church, but also a ton about just sort of modern politics and government. And he's a huge thinker and really important, and happened to be a seminary brother of these two characters. And he sat for an interview with me for this podcast to talk about their time in the seminary, and what the evidence that I have as to their answer to that question is what they went on to do, which is the subject of episode 4 and 5 and 6ish, which is the Patrick and Floyd were stationed after they were ordained at a church in downtown Boston called the Paulist Center. there were Paulists, that was their order, and for non-Catholics, the Paulists are kind of like the AV club nerds of all the orders, and they went to this place, which is in downtown Boston, and were tasked with sort of bringing it into the modern age. They, as priests, were coming out of this attempt by a pope named Pope John the 23rd in the early 60s, who tried to modernize the church by holding a giant ecumenical council that came to be known as Vatican II, whose job it was to modernize the church. What he wanted to do was make it so that Mass was no longer in Latin, but in the local vernacular, which is now true. And there were all sorts of other proposals on the table: married priests, birth control, like, and into female priests. Why not? There were all sorts of things that they were sort of considering. And unfortunately, that pope died shortly after the council began, and then all of his proposed reforms, most of them were sort of clawed back by his successor, who was Spontini. His name was, let's see, Paul VI. And it's interesting to talk actually about the popes in light of the new pope, Pope Leo, who seems pretty great. I think he would actually like this podcast very much. In any case, so Patrick and Floyd, they go to the Paulist Center, tasked with modernizing, bringing the spirit of Vatican II into the Paulist Center, but they were met with a church full of old guys who were used to things the way they were. They'd learned Latin in order to give Mass in Latin, and it was also a retirement for old priests, and they were fairly quickly ostracized and sent to the basement, and were tasked with starting an education center. But rather than doing that, they set about saving the world as best they could. And so they started a restaurant for the poor. They were going to do a soup kitchen down there, but then they thought, well, actually, why not? Why can't poor people have the restaurant experience with tablecloths and waiters? And so they started a tablecloth restaurant instead. So, and it's still going today. It's called the Wednesday Night Supper Club, where you go and you sit down, and the people in need come in and are served by volunteers who come over, and then their plates are cleared. And it has the mechanism rather of a restaurant rather than a bowl with a ladle and a single file line. They eat with dignity. So they started that. They started a bunch of other programs, and the basement became this beehive of activity. And then to pay for it all, Patrick invented the pledge walk. And he started the Walk for Hunger, which is also still operating today in Boston. And it is the oldest pledge walk in the United States, where people get sponsors and walk for 20 miles around the city of Boston. And so they absolutely, in no uncertain terms, decided they were in this vocation to participate in the world. And the only question was if anything could stop them.
I'm so glad you're telling that story. It's one of my favorite stories with the soup kitchen. What do they do? They're giving us space, and that's what they do. And it's great. That's also like a really nice segue to the nonviolent movement,
Mhm.
because you mentioned the word dignity, and nonviolence come from satyagraha, from Gandhi's movement, that it's nonviolence is sort of like a mistranslation. And some of that is better translated as, soul force or truth force, or even with the word dignity, right? It's really this idea of like dignity behind it.
Hmm.
And there's one thing, there's so many things, but there's one image you painted in the podcast where you talk about how there was draft cards that men were receiving, but at some point they started to do this thing which I had heard about before, but honestly it never quite dawned on me how horrible that must have been, where they on TV they would pick a birthday.
Yes.
They would pick can you tell that? Yeah, you're much better than me at tell this. Can you tell that? Because I think it really lends how real this was, how horrible what
Hmm.
what young men were facing,
Hmm.
and then how the nonviolent movement from this Catholic left, these young people really were present to it, and we're really like we can't just take mic to you.
It was horrific. I mean, I was born after this was all over, but from what I was able to gather, the Vietnam War, sort of the escalation of it, began creeping in 1965. There was Operation Rolling Thunder, where that was a bombing campaign that was supposed to end the conflict before it started. It was supposed to last 3 weeks, but instead lasted 3 years. President Johnson authorized napalm, which was a combination of gasoline and melted styrofoam that would burst from the bombs and land on the skin of children and burn hotter and longer than gasoline alone, and they couldn't get it off, so it was like sticky and burning. And so that fact of civilians being tortured alive by these, what the military euphemistically calls an anti-personnel weapon, was something that really activated people, young people in the United States, seeing first they saw this horror of napalm, just an absolute atrocity, and their government committing an atrocity on a small agrarian nation and the children of it. So that was the first horror. And the second horror was the escalation of the draft, which had been around for decades, was there all through World War II, through the Korean War. When you're 18 in the United States, I had to do this. You go to the post office, if you're a young man, you go to the post office and you fill out your draft card. And you can't get a federal Stafford loan for college unless you fill out your draft card. So they hold that over you. And then if there's a war and they need warm bodies and cannon fodder, they will then send you a letter in the mail that gives you a date to show up for a physical. And then at the physical, which if you pass, which everyone did, except for the people who would sabotage their bodies by doing all sorts of crazy shit so that their blood pressure would be sky high when they got there, they they then would be put on a bus and brought to an induction center, and then they would be handed a rifle in an unfamiliar hemisphere and be shot at, and many killed. And so between 1965 and 71, I think at its peak, 35,000 young men a month were going to war, were being sort of taken out of their lives. And for many, a walk to the mailbox was basically a game of Russian roulette, where if there's a thick envelope from the federal government, you're fucked, you know? And so when this started, they needed eventually to create there was, of course, an uproar. There's immediate uproar. An entire generation was being picked off like a horrible carnival game. And so people started to make a lot of waves, call their Congress people. And then in a very macabre fashion, they created something, a mechanism by which they could make it seem as humanely random as possible. And this was called the draft lottery. And what they would do is they did this on live television. There would be a night, I think it was August of 69, I think. They had a giant drum full of these blue plastic pellets, and they rolled the drum, and one by one, they would have dignitaries come, people in the UN, senators, other people, and they would take out a pellet and open it, and there would be a date. It was sort of a little more complicated. It's a code that meant a date, but it doesn't matter. There was a date on it, September 4th. And so September 4th would go on a bulletin board. And that meant that if you were born on September 4th, you were next. And then another date, April 14th, you were second after everyone born September 4th, and so on. And so they came up with a list of these birthdays. And as people watched on live television, there were reports of people hearing screams from neighbors' houses when the birthday would be announced. And so then young men would refer to themselves as having a good or a bad lottery number. And a good number meant you probably weren't going to be drafted, at least no time soon, and you had this sort of stay of execution for a little while. And a bad one meant off you go, you know? And so that led to these priests, led by a man named Phil Berrigan, whose daughter just wrote me on Instagram and listened to the show, which I'm very thrilled about. He was looking for a way beyond protest, beyond nonviolent protest, to do something drastic to end these horrors that were happening. And there was, as he was looking, there would be protests. They would go to the White House, and the White House wouldn't answer. They would burn draft cards, and then Senator Jesse Helms, a horrendous hobgoblin, would would uh, would then write laws to make any form of protest illegal as new protests were being developed. And so it was sort of a dead end. And so there was this priest, a Josephite priest named Phil Berrigan, and he was looking for something much more serious to do. The tenets of nonviolence from Gandhi and Martin Luther King sort of dictate very specific rules about it. And he started to be willing to go outside the norms of nonviolent resistance, because strict nonviolence includes no destruction of property. It's more about filling up the jails and putting pressure on the system. But he was getting really agitated and pissed off about how this was becoming really difficult to figure out how to stop. And then there was this kid in Minnesota, in Big Lake, Minnesota, whose name was Barry Bondus. And Barry Bondus was of draftable age, and he went to his mailbox and he got the telltale letter. And it told him to turn up for his physical. But he had 11 brothers. So there were 12 boys in his family. All were soon to be draft age. And his father was terrified that he would lose his 12 sons to war. And so his father went before the draft board. So the phrase draft board can mean two things. One, it can mean the actual physical building, the office where all the draft files were kept, because there were no computers back then. Or two, it can refer to the board of human beings who made decisions about people who wanted to be conscientious objectors or things like that. And so they did the business of that particular draft board, and there were a board of select people. So he went before the humans in the board and begged for his son's life, basically, and said, "I have 11 other sons. I'm very scared about this." And there was a World War II veteran who was on this particular board in Big Lake, Minnesota, who said, "You got 12 sons, well, where are the rest of them?" And that kind of flippant response so enraged Barry Bondus's father that he came home and he had a family-wide meeting with all 12 boys, and they talked about what to do about this. And so their decision, which would change the course of American history, was to defecate in a bucket, all 12 of them, for 3 days, until it was sloshing and full of human excrement. And then Barry brought the bucket down to his local draft board and slammed it on the counter and said, "Here are the rest of my brothers. What do you want me to do with them?" And the secretary sitting there was like, "I have no idea what you're talking about." And he's like, "You have no idea what I'm talking about? Well, then I'll just go put them over here." And he walked behind her and he opened a bunch of drawers and he dumped the feces all over the draft files and spent 14 months in federal prison, but had no regrets. And Phil Berrigan, the priest who is looking for a new form of protest, hearing about this attack on a draft board, was like, "Say, that's not a bad idea." And he then devised this other action where he would go on to pour blood on draft files and wait to be arrested. That was the first official action of the Catholic left. And Barry Bondus's dumping of the feces became known as the movement that started the movement.
Yeah, yeah. There's so many great also lines in your podcast. So that's one of the ones that definitely. But here's the thing, right? What they found out, if I remember correctly, is that they found out at some point that, being that this was before computers, if
Mm-hmm.
those draft cards were destroyed, nobody could know who had been drafted. In other words, if your draft card was destroyed, you would never be called again because you were not in the system, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
That's exactly
So
right.
destroying property literally became saving a life.
100%.
So here's and I want to also talk after this. I'm going to talk about the women because we're talking all about the guys, right? But then there's like amazing things. So, but here's the thing. What is striking to me about the podcast is this um, juxtaposition of on one side the government that is so inhumane and the FBI and Hoover and they're all like they want to send people to die into something that doesn't even make sense.
Hmm.
And on the other hand, you have people that are simply shredding cards that
Hmm.
will save life, and they're the ones risking 50 years in jail.
Yes.
Like it's so incredible. And the one thing that I love about this podcast that I really it just I think is so heart opening in so many ways is that the movement to destroy the property and save life, right? They are getting together, they're full of love for each other, they're building community, they're raising families, they're singing, they're all have no money and yet they're giving and creating space for people to be fed. They're in solidarity with each other, they're connecting, they're I mean it's like this love joy, space, and out of love risking and taking amazing, action and courage.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, like what is this about, like killing people? It's just it makes it so real, the whole thing.
It is shocking that I hadn't thought about that. That's such a brilliant observation that there is the strange balance and opposition between the government was looking for a winnable war against communism, like a symbolic fight against communism, as a way to sort of defeat it for good, but not have to actually start World War III. And so they were like, oh, perfect. Vietnam, this tiny nation that has Ho Chi Minh on the march in the north. We can absolutely use the American fighting force to stop them, and then it will look like we've defeated communism forever. So they were after this pipe dream. They would, of course, soon discover that it is very difficult when you're on someone's turf and it is a grassy, wet, jungle-covered landscape, to keep your orientation in a situation like that. And so they started chasing their money very quickly. A lot of people started dying for this pipe dream of a symbolic winnable war against communism on the one hand. And then on the other, you had these people, these ordinary citizens who saw that their government was immoral and needed to be corrected, and no one else was going to correct it. So, as citizens of the United States, they said, it is our job to fix this and they used to say, you have to put your body where your mouth is. They would put their body where their mouths were, and risk arrest, and risk spending the rest of their lives in jail because the suffering of their fellow Americans was so dire to them that it was that level of an emergency. And so they were fighting a real fight while the government authorities were fighting a fake fight. And that is such a great, I wish I'd thought of that, damn it.
But I mean, it comes through all the way. To me, that was really something that I feel is so important because having that love and hope and friendship, it's a fuel that will sustain you in ways that nothing else will. I
Yes,
really feel, and that was
it's
very
so true.
strong. So one of my favorite episodes and title of the episode is number three because there's none in combat boots. So unwashed, great, right? Like I just loved all her stuff. But I think there's so many women doing amazing things, really. So I wonder if you want to say more about the role also of love and maybe even the women's movement in this, because to
Yeah.
me it's just another wonderful part.
And it's such an important part of the story. There have been a couple of books written, a couple of documentaries made about this whole movement, but there was a lot of tension between the genders during this time, um, and the nuns and the women and the lay women of the movement were really the engine and the backbone. But because the Catholic Church is still the Catholic Church, and you can take the the priest out of the church, you can't necessarily take the church out of the priest. Um, the women of this movement faced a certain amount of a term I learned during in the process of creating it, clericalism. And clericalism is basically the way that everyone kind of fawns on a priest. Everyone around a priest will sort of make sure they're comfortable. You feel like there's a celebrity in your midst. It's very deliberately created. That aura is created by sort of like the trappings of the church with the costume and the whole deal. And what ends up happening, and actually the late Pope Francis talked about this quite a bit. By the way, I am not a Catholic. I don't have any religion, but I find Catholicism so fascinating that I spent a year of my life making a podcast about it. But Pope Francis talked about clericalism and the problem with it, because it leads to uh, uh, certainty, like sort of a toxic certainty among priests, right? And it also leads to patriarchy, and it leads to sexism and chauvinism and things like that. So, because the priests are sort of centralized and made very important. So, this movement was filled with priests who were used to being priests, and any human is going to succumb to the siren song of clericalism at some point. And the women in the movement, including people like Anne Walsh, who is a wonderful character. She called me yesterday. She listened to the last episode and gave me a call, and she's just fantastic. And many others. There's a woman named Cookie Rodolphi.
Oh my God, I love cookies so much.
She's great. She's great. She's great. I'm going to finally, I've interviewed her many times, but we're going to meet in person in late June, and I can't wait because I'm going to be passing through San Jose where she lives. In any event, so Anne, Cookie, the woman named Leanne Moshe, Marianne, many other people in this movement were unbelievable badasses. And they really started to give the priests and the whole the whole clericalism issue the business, and there were moments where there was this one action that happened in New York, kind of early in the movement, where there were these five women who splintered off from a New York action just as the action started happening. Phil Berrigan dumped blood, and then he and his brother set fire in Catonsville 9, and then there was the Milwaukee 14, and then there was the New York 8, and then all these other actions started happening, like all over the country. There are hundreds. I couldn't actually address all of them. So I just did my best to sort of thread a story of 6 characters through them. But so there were these 5 women at a pivotal point in the movement who started to call themselves Women Against Daddy Warbucks. And they splintered off from a planned New York action because there was just too much conversation, there's too much debate. Anytime there'd be planning an action, the men would start saying things like, well, I don't know if a woman can climb a wall, and things like that. And they were just getting so pissed off that they decided to do an action all on their own. And they actually transformed the whole movement, the Women Against Daddy Warbucks, where and no one knows how they did it. They did all these incredible things. Like they broke into 13 draft boards in Manhattan in one night, and they stole all the draft files. They also took all these. They knew how the system operated on a very deep level, and so they also took other files and journals and things that made it impossible for the draft board to even to ever resume drafting again, because there were laws about the order in which they had to draft people. And so they knew exactly what to target. And back then, all the young men were classified with different letter classifications. So 4F was if you worked on a farm and the farm couldn't last without you. You got a 4F or something like that. I can't remember the numbers. And there are a bunch of different ones. 1A was available for service, and that was so your doom. If you were 1A, you were on borrowed time. So it was the 1A files that they always wanted to find in these draft boards. Anyway, so they found all the 1A files, and the best thing that the women against Daddy Warbucks did is they grabbed pliers and yanked the ones and the A's out of all the typewriters in all 13 draft boards, which was like great. And then they decided up until then,
I just have to say, I love the plier story so much. I was like laughing so much when I heard that. That was so brilliant.
it's great, isn't it? It's great. It's great. It's fabulous. And it's so terrific. And so they then decided they weren't going to get arrested. This is the craziest part of all. They were like, everyone up until us had been 4 actions or 3 actions, and everyone's stood around waiting to be arrested afterwards. We are going to break in under cover of night, and then we're going to surface at Rockefeller Center the next day, and then the FBI. And so the next day at noon, they announced to the press that they're going to surface. The FBI is there. A bunch of movement people are there, and they just start throwing. They had shredded all the files, and they're just throwing the confetti everywhere. And it's a giant melee. And the FBI moves in to arrest them. The movement people move in to protect them, and it's this huge, like shoving, like 50-person shoving match. One of them escaped. Never resurfaced ever again. She was on the lam for the rest of her life. And never did any more interviews. She's like a legend, a ghost. She's just gone. Others were arrested, but they showed the power, the backbone of the women in this movement and what they're capable of. And then suddenly everything was on. Well, I don't know if everyone would say this, but it felt like a bit more of an even footing, the men and the women, because the men had been shown in no uncertain terms the ways in which they were forgetting that women hold up half the sky. And that was a really beautiful, I think, element of this, and ended up being a story that I really wanted to make sure was told, because when the story of this movement has been told, which is actually pretty rare, it's often from it's kind of like a male point of view. The male gaze, if you will, and the women of this movement were such absolute like badasses that they had to be the ones in the forefront.
And I think that really from your podcast, that's what I got a lot. I mean, there were so many of the stories, and the women were just like amazing, amazing. So okay, I have so many things. Let me look at all the things I want to ask you. All right, I want to ask you about well, I want to ask you about, your own personal reason for doing this, and your purpose in doing this.
Oh yeah. So well, yeah, I have a very personal connection to this story, which operates as a bit of a twist in the telling. So I'll try and not reveal too much about it, but I will say that these people are where I come from. They are. It's been to be. I like to joke that God hates the Irish. And to be Irish Catholic is it's a complicated trajectory through the American experiment, because many of us came here under duress during the botched genocide of the Irish potato famine, which was not a famine. There was plenty of food in Ireland, but the British forcibly exported it to their army around the world. And so when the potatoes had their blight between 1845 and 1848, the British saw it as a convenient way to let millions of Irish starve to death. And so many died. Some escaped across the water to usually Boston, and that's where I'm from. And I come from sort of a legacy where this is very on brand for the Irish. Of all the American cities they could have gone to, they chose the one that hated Irish people the most. And so when they got there, they were living in tenement slums, and every help wanted sign had a sign below it that said Irish need not apply. And the Irish were just considered the unwashed, and for there to be this botched genocide followed by an exodus which brought these generations of people into a very hostile environment where the only way they managed to finally pull themselves out was through the civil service, like becoming firemen, becoming policemen. My grandmother and becoming domestic servants, but the domestic servants would often end up in indentured servitude. My grandmother was sold into indentured servitude when she was 12 years old, like really awful ways to live. And uh, and that generational trauma, I think, follows all of us around, which is why the Irish, I think, party so hard, which is why we prefer humor, and the more gallows humor, the better over every other every other emotion. There's a thing I say in the 10th episode, when I'm sort of the 10th episode is I indulged myself to make a very personal essay. Everything up until the 10th episode is all plot. It's got heists, it's got a trial of the century, it's got forbidden love. I mean, it's like priests making out with people. It's crazy. But then the 10th episode I decided would be one for me, where I could talk about my own personal connection to all this. And there's an old saying, which is, what's the use of being Irish if the world doesn't break your heart? And so this was there are, on two levels, a very important story for me to tell. One, I won't give away because it'll be great for you to listen to, but it's a very personal story. But on the other is very cultural kind of understanding of these people I grew up with, who it didn't dawn on me were different than everybody else until I was in my adulthood. You know, when you grow up when you grow up in an Irish town, by the way, Boston has become a very Irish town. From being one where the Irish were completely unwelcome, it went from 2% Irish in 1842, 1855, 20% Irish, 1900, 50% Irish. And so now you'd never know that there was this, like, it had been so hostile. But anyway, so to grow up in that place, with all of its extremely bizarre, colorful characters, none of whom have any generational wealth, all of whom have generational trauma. Um, it's incredibly special, and it is moving and poignant and sad and funny, and it and and I even have there's even like a self-loathing mechanism. Like when you're looking at a list of names and you see Seamus O'Mick Fitzpatrick on there, you think to yourself, well, that's not a serious person. You know what I mean? Or like, they're not going to get the promotion because they're Irish. What are they going to do? They're just going to pass out shots, you know? So and I even catch myself looking through squinted eyes at my fellow Irishmen, because there's a level of painful encoding that we all pick up. So anyway, the podcast was a way for me to do sort of have an odyssey into what that is, what these emotions are, what led to the weird experience of life that is so at the same time hilarious and sorrowful.
Let me tell you all the reasons why I like your podcast and why I encourage everybody to listen to it. And I can't wait to see the mini series on Netflix. All right.
Me
All right.
neither.
I love any stories from the 60s where there are hippies involved. All right. Um, Anything that really reminds us of the power of love, whatever that love is, whether it's romantic or love of community, love for children, friends. I mean, I think there's so much in that, family, anything in the story. Really a powerful reminder to be courageous and to, participate in the world with our vocation. I think that's something that is so important right now. Incredible storytelling. And to me also, I grew up Catholic, but I'm not Catholic. But I've noticed very often how there is a whole part of the faith that is very much about making change in a positive way, and
Hmm.
very few people talk about it,
Yeah.
and I have a good friend in Italy who's Catholic and involved, and she sometimes tells me stories or even historical things that I don't even know, and it's like wonderful conversations. And one of the things I really believe is that, okay, let me say this. One of the things I've learned that I've read years ago from a book, and I don't remember from whom, but this guy said, everybody has a religion. It might not be what they think it is. Meaning that we only think of
Hmm.
religion as like, if you're Muslim or if you're Catholic or you whatever. But a religion is basically what you really believe in and you get together with other people
Yeah.
and live your life according to. Okay.
Yep.
So in this book, he said, you might think that your religion is God, but it's really money. Or you
Hmm.
might think that, you don't have any religion, but your religion is love because that's how you live your life, right? And I think I read
Hmm.
it many, many years ago. It made a huge impact on me. And I started to really see that if you look for how people live their lives and, what they do with other people, you get their religion. And you
Wow.
see that across what we call religion very often, there is this theme of love. And you can have those conversations, and it doesn't matter what people say, it's their religion.
Yeah.
So, your podcast reminds me of that.
Yes. My God, that's wonderful. That's so funny. It's so funny that you should say all of that because I have been. I mean, I'm a, agnostic, borderline atheist, and so I have been really grappling with my entire purpose has been to put this story into the world for 25. I started working on it in 1999, and I've been working on it for 26 years, and now, as of yesterday, it is gone. It's out. It's just not there. It's not mine anymore. It's out in the world, and so I am left like sort of between purposes, but also in a way between paradigms where I have believed in the act of creation because I knew one day eventually I would be able to create this sort of magnum opus and if I believed enough in creation, even if I was procrastinating on working on this one by working on something else, I it would eventually get me there, and it did. And but it got me there, and now it's over. And so I have been over the last couple of days and weeks really starting to think like, wow, I might need to find something to believe in again. And to you say that's so fascinating because I sort of in between religions right now, uh, and that gives me comfort to know that we are built for it. We're built to believe in something, and the way we live our life, even if we don't consciously decide it, the way we live our lives will show it to other people, and that is enough for me to hang my hat on until I know which way is up again.
Yeah. Also, the podcast has some really interesting characters, like Howard Zinn shows up,
Hmm.
as of
I interviewed
course.
Howard Zinn 6 months before he died,
Wow.
and he was a lovely human being. Of course, I mean exactly as you would hope and wonder and figure. He's Howard Zinn. He was one of the greatest Americans to ever live, and he welcomed me into his home. I'm really good friends with his son, and that's sort of how that happened. But he's really really a wonderful man.
Amazing. And episode 9 made me cry. Episode 10 made me cry. It's just a wonderful journey. So if anybody, if you're listening to this, if you're watching this, really check it out. Divine Intervention. Brendan, how can people find your podcast, find you, keep up with all the updates of anything else you might do?
Thank you for asking. Because here's what I didn't know when I decided to name this show Divine Intervention. There are like 50 podcasts named Divine Intervention, and so no one can find it. And so you have to go. This will sound self-serving, but it isn't. You have to Google. Divine Intervention and Brendan Hughes, and then you'll find it. Or iHeart. You can find it on the iHeart Radio app. iHeart is the distributor, so you can like go to the iHeart Radio app or podcast app or whatever, and that way you can find it. But if you look for it in the wild on Apple Podcast, you'll get a million. And my logo, the show graphic is an upside down man in glasses who is the character Patrick, and it says, and it's yellow, and it says Divine Intervention. But unfortunately, there are other Divine Intervention podcasts that also use yellow, and so you might find yourself in the wrong place. Anyway, upside down man, red letters that say Divine Intervention. Google Divine Intervention and Brendan Hughes, and you can find it. And I am on Instagram at Brendan Patrick Hughes, which is my whole Irish, very Irish sounding name. Uh, at Brendan Patrick Hughes, and then I'm on, Facebook. I think Facebook is like Facebook/Brendan Hughes, and
I
there
will
I am.
put all the links in the
Oh,
show
great.
notes.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
I
yeah,
will
so
make
come
it
on
very
down.
easy. Yeah. And anything else? Anything else that you would like to say about this before we wrap it up?
Well, Aurora, what you do is an incredible gift to the world, and I love what you are doing because we've all, I think, spent time living without purpose, and we can feel it when it happens, and it's painful, like an ache, like a side stitch when you're running is painful. It's like somewhere in your body you just know, like, this is not right. What I'm doing right now is not contributing to myself or to the world the way that I feel like it could. And so you're giving permission to think on the level of, wait a minute, I can find a purpose, and it may not be this, and maybe it's that, and it's scary, but I see people in Aurora's universe doing this, and so therefore maybe I can too. It's a beautiful thing, and I hope people tell you this every day. What you're doing is very important.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure to have you on the podcast, and can't wait to share this recording with everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, listeners. And thank you, Aurora. I'm a big fan.
And everybody, if you're interested in learning more about what you do, just visit repurposeyourpurpose.com. Until next time.